What if one sentence, just one careless, cutting sentence, could change how you see your entire family, not slowly, not over time, but instantly like a quiet crack turning into something you can no longer ignore? Because that's exactly how it began for me, not with a fight, not with a warning, but with a morning that felt ordinary until it wasn't. The sunlight came through the curtains the same way it always did, soft and familiar, touching the kitchen counters, warming the space that had once felt like the center of everything I had built, everything I had protected. Everything I believed still belonged to me, and I moved through my routine the way I always had, steady, calm, practiced, cracking eggs into the pan, placing bread into the toaster, pouring coffee into the same cup I had used for years. The small rituals that gave structure to a life that had already seen more change than it deserved. Have you ever held on to routine because it was the only thing that still felt yours? Because that's what this was for me. But something was different that morning, something I couldn't name at first, not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, like the air itself had shifted in a way that didn't belong to me anymore. Then she walked in, no greeting, no acknowledgement, just presence sharp, cold, distant. Her attention fixed on her phone, her posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension she carried, and before I could even process the silence, her voice cut through it, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that there was no misunderstanding. You eat like you own the place, but you don't do anything here, just sitting and taking up space like a parasite. And in that moment, everything stopped, not outside, not physically, but inside me, something paused, something that had been holding itself together quietly for far too long. Have you ever heard something so unexpected that your first reaction isn't anger but disbelief? Because that's what I felt, not shock, not even pain yet, just recognition. Recognition that this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't said in anger. This was something she had been thinking for a long time, and now she was comfortable enough to say it out loud. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't react the way most people would expect, because reacting too quickly gives people power they don't deserve, and I wasn't ready to give her that. Instead, I stood there, holding the spatula, watching the eggs cook as if nothing had happened, even though inside, her words had already settled deeper than I wanted to admit. Have you ever stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you understood the moment wasn't about speaking? Because that's what I chose. And then I looked at him, my son, sitting at the table, his laptop open, his eyes moving across the screen as if the world inside that device mattered more than the one unfolding right in front of him. For a brief second, I thought he would say something, anything, even a small correction, a simple acknowledgement that what had just been said was wrong, but he didn't. He just shifted slightly, his fingers continuing to type, his silence stretching longer than it should have. And that silence hurt more than her words ever could. Have you ever realized that silence from someone you love can feel like agreement? Because that's what it felt like, agreement, acceptance, permission. I placed the plate in front of him, my movements controlled, my expression unchanged, because I refused to let that moment define me outwardly, even though inwardly something had already begun to shift. He muttered a quiet thanks without looking up, the word empty, automatic, as if it carried no awareness of what had just happened. And that's when I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, not clearly, not completely. This wasn't just about her, this wasn't just about one comment, this was about how I was seen by both of them. Have you ever realized that disrespect doesn't start suddenly, it builds slowly until it feels normal? Because that's exactly what this was. Then I felt a small pair of arms wrap around me, soft, familiar, grounding, my granddaughter, holding onto me in a way that reminded me that not everything had changed, not everything had been lost. She didn't understand the words that had been spoken, but she understood the feeling, the tension, the shift, and in that moment, her presence steadied me more than anything else could. Have you ever been reminded of your worth by someone who doesn't even know they're doing it? Because that's what she gave me. I placed my hand gently on her head, taking a slow breath, letting the moment settle instead of explode, because I wasn't going to respond the way they expected. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend myself in a space where my value had already been reduced. Instead, I moved quietly to the sink, rinsing my cup under the steady stream of water, watching as the small crack along its edge caught the light, a reminder that things can endure even when they're not perfect anymore. And as I stood there, something inside me became clear, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. I had given too much to be treated like nothing. And the most dangerous part of that realization wasn't the hurt, it was the clarity. Because once you see your position clearly, you can't pretend it's something else anymore. I dried my hands slowly, turned back toward the room, and for the first time that morning, I didn't see it the way I used to. I didn't see my home, I didn't see comfort. I saw something else entirely, something I had allowed to happen without realizing it fully until now. And that's when the thought came, quiet but firm, not emotional, not reactive, just certain. This cannot continue. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't as powerless as they thought, and something they had completely forgotten was about to change everything. Have you ever given so much that it became invisible? Like the more you do, the less people notice, until one day you realize that what once felt like love now feels like obligation to everyone except you, because that's exactly where I found myself after that morning, not broken, not angry, but aware in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be before. The kitchen had gone quiet again, the same counters, the same walls, the same sunlight, but none of it felt the same anymore because once something shifts inside you, even familiar places start to look different. I moved slowly through the house, not cleaning, not fixing, not doing what I had always done without thinking, but simply observing, seeing it not as a routine, but as a record of everything I had given without ever keeping score. Have you ever walked through your own home and suddenly started noticing everything you've done for others? Because that's what I was doing. Every corner held something of mine, not just physically, but effort, time, sacrifice, things that don't leave visible marks but shape everything around them. The electricity that stayed on without interruption, the groceries that appeared without question, the repairs that were handled before they became problems, the quiet support that made their lives easier without ever demanding recognition. Have you ever been the reason everything works and no one realizes it until it stops? Because that realization doesn't come loudly, it builds slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore. I paused in the living room, my eyes resting on the walls, the furniture, the small details that had been chosen years ago, when this place wasn't just a house, it was a beginning. And that memory came back to me clearly, not as nostalgia, but as contrast, because there was a time when this home was filled with something different, something warmer, something that didn't need to be questioned. I remembered the years when every payment mattered, when every decision required thought, when this space wasn't taken for granted but protected, cared for, valued. Have you ever built something from nothing and then watched others treat it like it was always theirs? Because that's what this had become. When my son struggled, when life didn't go the way he expected, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for conditions. I didn't measure what it would cost me. I simply made space, space in my home, space in my life, space in everything I had worked for, because that's what you do when you believe family means something deeper than convenience. Have you ever helped someone without asking anything in return because you believed they would remember? Because that belief can be dangerous. At first, it felt right. It felt like we were rebuilding something together, like the house would once again hold laughter, connection, a sense of shared life that had been missing for too long. But slowly, almost invisibly, something changed. Not in one moment, not in one decision, but over time in small ways that were easy to overlook until they weren't. My role shifted, not announced, not discussed, just changed. I was no longer the one who led this space. I became part of it, then less than part of it, then something else entirely. Have you ever felt yourself slowly fading in a place you once belonged? Because that's what happened. Decisions were made without me. Plans were created without including me. Changes were made to my home without asking, as if my presence was no longer relevant to the life happening inside it, and I allowed it. Not because I agreed, not because I didn't notice, but because I believed peace was more important than control. Have you ever stayed silent, thinking it would protect the relationship? Because sometimes silence doesn't protect anything, it teaches people how far they can go, and they went further than I ever expected. The meals I cooked became expected, not appreciated. The bills I covered became normal, not acknowledged. The space I provided became theirs, not shared. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped being seen as the person who made it all possible. I became background. Have you ever realized you've been reduced to something people only notice when it's missing? Because that realization doesn't hurt immediately, it settles slowly until it becomes undeniable. I walked into my bedroom and sat down, the quiet heavier now, but clearer too, because clarity changes how silence feels. It no longer felt empty, it felt revealing. And as I sat there, I began to connect everything, not just what happened that morning, but everything that had led up to it. The tone, the behavior, the assumptions, the entitlement, it all pointed to the same truth. This wasn't new. This was just the first time it had been said out loud. And once something is spoken, it can't be taken back. Have you ever realized that words don't create reality, they expose it? Because that's what her words had done. They didn't change anything, they revealed everything. I looked around the room again, not emotionally, not with attachment, but with understanding, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for too long: what happens if I stop? Not stop living here, not stop caring, but stop giving in the way I always had, stop filling the gaps they never noticed, stop being the silent support they relied on without acknowledging. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stepped back? Because that question changes everything. And in that moment, I knew something important, not as a reaction, not as anger, but as truth. I had been giving them more than they ever understood, and they had been taking it as if it was theirs by right. That imbalance couldn't continue. And that's when I remembered something they had completely forgotten, something that would change the entire situation in an instant. What if the power you've been searching for was never lost, just forgotten, tucked away somewhere you stopped looking? Because that's the realization that changes everything, not suddenly, not loudly, but in a way so clear that once you see it, you can't go back to being who you were before. And that's exactly what happened to me in that quiet room where I finally stopped looking at my life through their eyes and started seeing it through my own. I sat there for a long moment, not moving, not reacting, just letting the weight of everything settle into something steady, something grounded, because clarity doesn't rush. It arrives when you're finally ready to accept it. Have you ever felt a shift inside you, where something that once felt heavy suddenly becomes simple? Because that's what this was. I leaned forward slowly and reached toward the drawer beside my bed, the one I hadn't opened in a long time, not because I had forgotten what was inside, but because I had chosen not to think about it, as if leaving it untouched would somehow keep everything else balanced, peaceful, unchanged. But peace built on silence isn't peace, it's delay, and delay always ends eventually. My fingers rested on the handle for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because I knew that whatever I was about to take out wasn't just a document, it was a decision waiting to be made. Have you ever known that opening something would change everything? Because that's what this felt like. I pulled the drawer open and reached inside, moving past things that no longer mattered until my hand touched the familiar edge of a folder, worn slightly from time, but still intact, still steady, just like the truth it held. I brought it out carefully and placed it on my lap, not rushing to open it, because I already knew what was inside. I just hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge what it meant. For years, it had been nothing more than a memory, a record of something important, something significant, but not something I needed to use. Until now. Have you ever had something valuable, but never realized when it was time to use it? Because that's what this was. I opened the folder slowly, the sound of paper shifting in the quiet room louder than it should have been, or maybe it only felt that way because of what it represented. Inside were the documents, clean, clear, undeniable, each page carrying a truth that didn't depend on anyone's opinion, anyone's behavior, or anyone's perception. It was simple, it was direct, it was final. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel uncertain about my place. I understood it completely. Have you ever looked at something and realized this changes everything? Because that's exactly what this did. I ran my fingers lightly over the page, not to confirm what I already knew, but to connect with it, to feel the weight of it in a way that made it real, not just legally, but personally, because this wasn't just about ownership. It was about everything that had gone into it. Every sacrifice, every decision, every moment that had built this life piece by piece. And suddenly, all of those invisible contributions that had been dismissed, ignored, or forgotten were no longer invisible. They were here, documented. Protected, real. Have you ever realized that proof doesn't just validate your position, it restores your confidence in it? Because that's what this did for me. I leaned back slightly, holding the folder steady, and let my thoughts move backward, not to dwell on the past, but to understand it clearly, to see the difference between what had been and what had become. There was a time when this house was not just a place to live. It was a promise, something built together, something earned, something respected, and the memory of that time didn't make me emotional, it made me certain. Because I knew what it had taken to create it, and that meant I knew exactly what it was worth. Have you ever remembered where something started and realized how far it had drifted? Because that's what I was seeing now. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about identity, about presence, about value. And for too long, I had allowed those things to be defined by someone else's behavior instead of my own reality. But that was over, quietly. Completely, I closed the folder gently, not because I was done with it, but because I no longer needed to look at it to understand what it meant. I already knew. And knowing changes how you move, it changes how you think. It changes how you respond. Have you ever reached a point where you stop reacting and start deciding? Because that's where I was now. I stood up slowly, not with urgency, not with tension, but with something far more powerful: certainty. And certainty doesn't rush, it doesn't need to prove itself, it simply exists. I walked toward the window and looked out at the same view I had seen every day, but this time it felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because I had. And once you change, everything else follows. The question was no longer what they thought, it was no longer how they treated me, it was no longer whether I should speak or stay silent. The question had become something else entirely. What am I going to do now that I know the truth? Have you ever realized that once you see your power, you can't ignore it anymore? Because that's exactly what this moment was. And the answer didn't come with noise or emotion. It came quietly, clearly, like something that had been waiting for me to accept it all along. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to ask for respect in a space where it had already been denied. I was going to do something else, something they would never expect. Because once I understood what that paper really meant, I knew exactly how to remind them whose house this truly was. What if the strongest response isn't what you say, but what you quietly decide to do next? Because most people think power is loud, that it shows itself through confrontation or anger, but real power often moves in silence. In calm decisions that no one sees coming until it's too late to undo them, and that's exactly where I found myself, not reacting, not arguing, but thinking in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. The house felt unusually still that afternoon, not empty, not lifeless, just different, as if it was waiting for something to change. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't moving through it as someone trying to maintain peace. I was moving through it as someone preparing to restore it. Have you ever stopped trying to fix everything and started deciding what actually deserves to stay? Because that shift changes everything. I sat down at the edge of my bed again, the folder resting beside me, no longer something hidden, no longer something avoided, but something understood, something I was ready to use, not emotionally, not impulsively, but intentionally. And intention is what separates reaction from strategy. I reached for my phone slowly, scrolling through numbers I hadn't contacted in years, names that belonged to a part of my life I had placed aside, not forgotten, but no longer needed until now. Have you ever gone back to something you once relied on, only when you truly needed it again? Because that's what this felt like. My finger hovered over the contact for a brief second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because I knew this call wasn't just about logistics. It was about change, real change, the kind that doesn't leave space for things to return to how they were before. And when I pressed it, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. The voice on the other end was warm, professional, familiar in a way that reminded me of a time when decisions like this were made with purpose, not hesitation. And as I spoke, my words came out steady, calm, without explanation, without justification, because I didn't need to defend what I already knew was right. I didn't tell the full story. I didn't explain the insult, the silence, the years of slow erasure, because this wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. Have you ever realized that sometimes the most important decisions don't require anyone else to understand them? Because that's exactly what this was. Arrangements were made quickly, efficiently, the kind of process that moves forward the moment you commit to it. And as the conversation ended, I placed the phone down and sat there for a moment, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aware of what I had just set in motion. Because once a decision like this is made, it doesn't stay contained. It begins to unfold step by step, whether others are ready for it or not. And they weren't ready, not even close. Have you ever made a decision quietly, knowing it would shock everyone else later? Because that's exactly what I had done. I stood up slowly and walked toward the closet, opening it with the same calm I had carried all day, not rushing, not hesitating, because this wasn't about leaving. It was about stepping back, just enough to let everything reveal itself. I pulled out a suitcase, one I hadn't used in years, its surface slightly worn, its presence almost symbolic, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. Have you ever prepared to leave, not because you were running away, but because you were creating space for something to change? Because that's what this was. I packed lightly, not taking everything, not treating it like an ending, but like a pause, a deliberate step away from a situation that needed to unfold without me standing in the middle of it. A few clothes, a few essentials, and then almost without thinking, I reached for something else: my mug, the one I had used that morning, the one with the small crack along its edge, still holding strong despite everything it had been through. I wrapped it carefully and placed it inside, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of something important: endurance. Have you ever held on to something small because it represents something much bigger? Because that's what it meant to me. As I zipped the suitcase, I felt something settle inside me, not doubt, not fear, but resolve, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's already decided. And yet, even in that clarity, a thought crossed my mind: my granddaughter, her small arms, her quiet understanding, the only presence in that house that still saw me without judgment, without expectation, without taking anything for granted. Have you ever made a decision that was right, but still felt heavy because of someone you loved? Because that's what this was. But I knew something else too, that staying in a situation where I was being diminished would not teach her the right lesson. And leaving, even temporarily, would show her something far more valuable: that respect matters, that boundaries matter, that silence should never come at the cost of self worth. I placed the suitcase near the door and took one last look around the room, not with attachment, not with regret, but with understanding, because this wasn't about losing anything, it was about reclaiming it. And once you understand that, everything feels different. The house was quiet again that evening, but this time the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt intentional, like something was about to happen. And then, the next morning, I made a move they never expected, one that would force them to finally see the truth they had ignored for far too long. What happens when the life people take for granted suddenly stops feeling secure, because comfort has a way of blinding people until something shifts just enough to make them question everything. And that's exactly what happened next, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through a single move that changed how they saw the house, the space, and most importantly, me. The morning arrived quietly, almost too peacefully, as if nothing unusual was about to happen, the sunlight stretching across the floor the same way it always did, the neighborhood moving through its routine without knowing what was about to unfold just a few doors down. Have you ever seen a calm moment right before everything changes? Because that's exactly what this felt like. I had already done what needed to be done. The call had been made. The steps had been set in motion. And now all that remained was to let it unfold. There's a certain kind of power in that, when you stop controlling every detail and simply allow your decision to take its natural course. Have you ever made a choice and then just watched what happened next? Because that's where I was. The door opened later than usual, not by me, but by someone who didn't fully understand what was coming. And when she stepped inside, her heels striking the floor with that same sharp rhythm, her presence filling the room with the same confidence she always carried, there was no hesitation in her voice, no awareness of what had already begun to shift beneath her feet. But that would change very soon. It didn't take long. The unfamiliar presence in the house made sure of that: a professional tone, a polite greeting, a question that sounded simple on the surface but carried something deeper underneath. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. Have you ever noticed how quickly confidence disappears when someone feels something slipping out of their control? Because that's exactly what happened. Her posture shifted, her voice tightened, her attention no longer on her phone but on the situation in front of her, something she couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore, couldn't control the way she always had. And then came the questions, sharp, direct, laced with disbelief, as if reality itself had made a mistake. What is this? What's going on? Who is this? The kind of questions that don't seek answers, they demand reassurance. But reassurance was no longer something I was giving. I responded calmly, evenly, without explaining more than necessary, because I didn't need to justify what was already mine to decide. Have you ever answered someone and watched them realize they're not in control anymore? Because that's what this moment became. The tension in the room grew quickly, not loudly, not explosively, but steadily, like something tightening just enough to make everyone aware that things were no longer the same. And then, as if the situation wasn't already clear enough, something else appeared, something impossible to ignore. Outside, visible, permanent enough to force acknowledgement, the kind of thing that turns a private situation into a public one in an instant. Have you ever seen someone panic, not because of what's happening, but because other people might see it? Because that's exactly what changed everything. The reaction was immediate, not thoughtful, not measured. Immediate, shock turning into frustration. Frustration turning into anger. Words spoken faster than they could be controlled, each one revealing more than intended, each one confirming exactly what I had already understood. This wasn't about the house, it was about control. About image, about expectation. And the moment those things were threatened, everything else fell away. My son stood there too, caught somewhere between confusion and realization, his certainty fading, his silence no longer protective but exposed, because this was the first time he was seeing the situation not as something distant, not as something he could ignore, but as something real, something happening directly in front of him. Have you ever watched someone realize they misunderstood everything, because that's what I saw. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself against accusations that no longer mattered, because once you reach a certain level of clarity, arguments lose their purpose. Instead, I stood there calmly, present, steady, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Nothing except stand in your truth. And that truth was finally becoming visible, not just to them, but to everyone around. Neighbors slowing down, eyes watching, conversations beginning. Because once something becomes public, it can no longer be ignored or rewritten. And that shift from private dismissal to public awareness changed everything. Have you ever noticed how people react differently when others are watching? Because that's when the real emotions come out, the real priorities, the real intentions. And in that moment, all of it was visible, completely. But what they didn't expect was that this was only the beginning, because the real truth was about to be revealed in front of everyone. What if the moment you've been quiet for so long suddenly becomes the moment everyone finally hears you, not because you raised your voice, but because the truth became impossible to ignore, because that's exactly what happened next, not through shouting, not through arguments, but through something far more powerful than either of those: visibility. The house that had once held quiet tension now held something else entirely, something that couldn't be contained behind walls anymore, something that had stepped out into the open where no one could pretend not to see it. Have you ever noticed how situations change the moment they become public? Because that's when reality stops being negotiable. The presence around the house grew, not dramatically, not in a chaotic way, but enough that the atmosphere shifted from private discomfort to shared awareness, and that shift alone changed how everything was unfolding. The same people who once dismissed me now stood in a space where dismissal wasn't possible anymore, where every reaction carried weight, where every word was no longer just between us, it was witnessed. And being witnessed changes behavior. Have you ever seen someone act differently just because others are watching? Because that's exactly what began to happen. The confidence that once filled the room started to fade, replaced by something less certain, less controlled, because control only works in silence, and silence was no longer protecting them. My daughter in law's voice, once sharp and unquestioned, now carried something else beneath it: unease. Not because she didn't believe what she had said before, but because now those words no longer existed in isolation. They were part of something larger, something visible, and visibility demands accountability. Have you ever realized that the truth feels heavier when others can see it too? Because that's what this moment became. My son stood there, no longer able to stay in the background, no longer able to hide behind distraction or silence, because silence only works when no one is paying attention, and now everyone was. His expression changed slowly, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough that I could see it, awareness beginning to replace avoidance. And that shift mattered more than anything else, because understanding doesn't arrive all at once, it builds. Piece by piece, moment by moment. Have you ever watched someone finally see something that was always right in front of them? Because that's what I was seeing now. I didn't need to say much. I didn't need to explain what had happened, because the situation itself was already speaking louder than any explanation I could give. The decisions I had made, the steps I had taken, the calm way I stood in that moment, it all told the story clearly enough. And sometimes clarity without words is stronger than any argument. Have you ever realized that you don't always need to defend yourself when the truth is already visible? Because that's exactly what this was. And then quietly, without announcement, I reached for something that had been with me the entire time, not hidden, not secret, just waiting for the right moment. The folder, the same one I had opened earlier. The same one that had shifted everything inside me. And as I placed it down, not forcefully, not dramatically, just present, the energy changed again, because this wasn't emotion, this was proof. Have you ever noticed how quickly situations change when facts enter the room? Because facts don't argue, they don't defend, they simply exist. And once they're there, everything else adjusts around them. I didn't rush. I didn't push it forward. I allowed it to sit there, to be seen, to be understood in its own time, because forcing truth creates resistance, but allowing it creates realization. And realization cannot be undone. My son's eyes moved toward it slowly, his expression tightening just slightly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because somewhere deep down he already knew what it meant. He just hadn't allowed himself to face it until now. Have you ever known something but avoided it until you couldn't anymore? Because that's what this was. My daughter in law didn't reach for it immediately. She hesitated. And that hesitation said more than any reaction could have, because confidence doesn't hesitate, but uncertainty does. and uncertainty had finally entered a space where it once didn't exist. The moment stretched just long enough to feel real, just long enough for everything to settle into place, because once a situation reaches this point, it doesn't need escalation, it needs acknowledgement. And slowly, piece by piece, that acknowledgement began to happen, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, and clarity changes everything. Have you ever watched a moment unfold and realized there's no going back from it? Because that's exactly where we were. And that's when everything finally shifted, because once they understood what that paper really meant, there was nothing left to argue. What happens when people finally understand your value only after they've lost the right to take it for granted? Because that realization doesn't come with comfort, it doesn't come with ease, it comes with consequences. The kind that force people to see clearly what they ignored for far too long, and that's exactly how everything came together in the end, not as chaos, not as revenge, but as something much stronger, balance restored where it had been missing. The house was quieter than it had ever been, not because it was empty, but because something had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone by words, apologies, or explanations. Have you ever felt a silence that wasn't heavy but final? Because that's what this was. The folder still rested where I had placed it, not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a fact simple, clear, undeniable. And once facts are understood, everything else rearranges itself around them. My son sat there longer than I expected, not speaking immediately, not reacting the way people often do when they're confronted with something they didn't anticipate, because this wasn't just information, it was realization. The kind that forces you to look back at everything you missed, everything you ignored, everything you chose not to see. Have you ever realized something too late and felt the weight of it all at once? Because that's what I saw in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't defensive, wasn't sharp, wasn't filled with excuses. It was quieter, steadier, but different in a way that mattered. There was awareness in it now, and awareness changes the direction of everything. He didn't try to argue, he didn't try to rewrite what had happened. He didn't look for a way to shift responsibility somewhere else, and that alone told me more than anything he could have said. Because accountability doesn't announce itself, it shows up in what people don't say. Have you ever noticed that real understanding doesn't need long explanations? Because that's exactly what this was. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, reacted the way someone does when control slips away. Not gradually, not quietly, but abruptly, her words faster now, sharper, trying to hold on to something that had already begun to fall apart. But this time it didn't work. Because once a situation becomes clear to everyone involved, control doesn't come from volume, it comes from truth. And truth had already settled into the room. Completely, I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue back, I didn't match her energy, because matching that energy would have pulled me back into a place I had already stepped out of. Have you ever realized that staying calm can be more powerful than reacting? Because that's what this moment required. Calm, clarity, presence, and nothing more. When she finished, the room didn't explode into argument the way she expected. It didn't spiral, it didn't escalate. Instead, it quieted again. And in that quiet, something became undeniable. This situation was no longer about opinions. It was about reality, and reality had already been decided. My son stood up slowly, not dramatically, not as a reaction, but as a decision, and that distinction mattered because decisions change outcomes, reactions only extend problems. He looked at me differently now, not as someone in the background, not as someone whose presence could be overlooked, but as someone he had finally understood. Fully. Have you ever seen someone truly see you after a long time of not being seen at all? Because that moment carries a different kind of weight. He didn't ask for things to go back to how they were. He didn't assume anything would return to normal, because he understood something important. What was broken wasn't the situation, it was the way it had been allowed to continue. And fixing that doesn't mean going backward, it means moving forward differently. Boundaries were set, not loudly, not harshly, but clearly, the kind that don't need to be repeated because they're understood the first time. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something settle completely, not relief, not victory, but peace. The kind that comes when you no longer question your place. Have you ever chosen yourself and realized it didn't take anything away from you, it gave you everything back, because that's what this became. Later, as everything calmed and the intensity of the moment faded into something more stable, more grounded, I found myself sitting quietly again, the house no longer feeling unfamiliar, no longer feeling like something I had lost control over, but something I had reclaimed, not aggressively, not forcefully, but rightfully. And that difference matters. My granddaughter came and sat beside me, her small presence once again grounding everything in a way nothing else could, her understanding still simple, still pure, untouched by the complexity of what had just unfolded. And in that moment, I realized something that mattered more than anything else. This wasn't just about me. It never was. It was about what she would learn from all of this. Have you ever realized that the way you stand up for yourself teaches others how to do the same? Because that's the real impact of moments like this, not the confrontation. Not the outcome, but the example. I looked around one last time, not searching for anything, not holding on to anything, just acknowledging what was now clear. This house was never just a place. It was a reflection of everything I had built, everything I had given, everything I had protected. And now it reflected something else too, respect. Finally, they thought I would always stay silent and accept everything, but in the end, I didn't just take my house back, I took my respect back too.